Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of JnJ.
We're shooting our first episode for the playlist Controverse.
Yes, that's Jake and I'm Jim, and here we are. I'm in my work office right now. So this is a new setting, and our topic today is racism. So much to talk about, so little time. Such a big topic. I'm going to start. My focus is on the racism in the United States, which, for better or for worse, almost exclusively the narrative is about white and black. Obviously, we are neither, but that doesn't mean we don't have plenty to say, and it affects all of us, right? To some degree. Jagan will give some commentary later on racism in Korea as he understands it, as he's maybe experienced it. Okay. Now, today I came prepared with a bunch of notes. Now, I have to say that my sources are various. Of course, I'm just one person, and as much as I try to listen to different voices, I'm limited, right, in my perspective. So I look forward to whatever comments anyone would like to leave after this video, and I'll try to be as concise as I can. All right, but let me start by just kind of giving some names of people who are really the ones that I'm going to cite from. Larry Elder, Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and others. All right, so I'll start by sharing kind of some notes I took from a conversation on the Rubin Report between Coleman Hughes and Dave Rubin. I'll share the link below for those of you who want to watch the whole thing. Basically, so Coleman Hughes is a really young guy, actually. He's a young, I believe he's from the West Indies. I'm not sure if he's Jamaican, but he's in his mid-20s. He's a young kind of intellectual who's gaining popularity now as just a really brilliant young mind. And so one thing he talked about was that basically no one knew who was telling the truth in the Michael Brown incident, which you may have heard of. This happened in, I think, 2013 in Ferguson, Missouri. Okay, this is the one where there's a famous "hands up, don't shoot" mantra, which is cited often by people from Black Lives Matter, but yet strangely, it was pretty much verified that Michael Brown never said those words. Okay, now. What's interesting from what Coleman Hughes experienced was, whatever the truth was, there was only one dominant opinion, which is basically that Michael Brown was unjustly killed by a white cop in an act of racism. Okay, and then that led to the larger point, which is that to be black, authentically black in America, there's pressure to blame everything. Every problem on whites, whether it's crime, education, poverty, okay? So it's really hard to go against the tide when everyone seems to have that same narrative. And when I say everyone, I'm talking about mainstream media, higher education, pop culture, celebrities for the most part, although as you heard, I'll mention a couple of dissenting views, okay? Now, for those who kind of don't follow that narrative, such as Coleman Hughes, who, by the way, he's not a religious guy. He's not taking any particular political stance. If anything, he's just more of just more of an intellectual guy, I'd say. But people like him and Larry Elder, who go against this narrative as blacks, are called self-hating. They're called Uncle Toms or coons. Okay. Coleman Hughes made his coming out was an article he wrote called "The High Price of Stale Grievances," and basically, again, there's an assumption of moral enlightenment that because he's black, he somehow has this greater, awareness or knowledge morally, and therefore is more qualified to speak than a non-black person, such as myself. Right, so that's another recurrent theme you'll see in basically the left, right? Which is unless you're black, you can't talk about racism. against blacks. Unless you're a woman, you can't talk about sexism, right? Unless you're gay, you can't talk about discrimination against gays. Now, Coleman made the point that in the New York Times, for example, the narrative was, that lynching is basically is a great evil, which almost no one disagrees with. But the issue he made was that even with the highest estimates, there were maybe 4,000 deaths per year from lynching, but yet twice as many die by homicide currently, right? But you don't hear about that. You don't hear about that, and that was one of the biggest things I just from various sources I saw was, okay, nowadays we hear all about Black Lives Matter. We hear all about George Floyd. We hear all about the various individuals who've been killed as unarmed black men and women by white police officers. And there's a handful, but that's just the point, is there's a handful. You can count them on two hands, how many have happened in the past maybe 10 or 20 years. Does that mean there's a widespread epidemic of police brutality? Does that mean that there's widespread murdering among innocent blacks by white cops? No. In fact, the evidence suggests that, again, thousands of deaths every year are black on black crime. Okay? I think half of all violent crimes in the United States are from blacks. And not to mention all the black babies that are aborted every single day. Now, I don't have the statistics, but I just found out that, do you know how many babies are aborted in the world every year? Just take a random guess.
I don't know per year, but
guess.
I've heard that almost every second, a certain number.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many seconds are in a year, but the number is 25 million by the Worldometer's estimates. Okay, and that's just reported abortions, right? So it's really hard to get an accurate figure on that. But Planned Parenthood, which is federally funded in the United States, I think they perform about 3,000 abortions per year as of 2000, a couple of years ago. So just think, all right, of those 3,000, I think the percentage that are black babies is disproportionate, right? So blacks are 13% of the population, roughly, in the U.S. Yet they're, I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they're more than 13%. I want to say between a third and a half of all aborted babies are black, all right? So if Black Lives Matter, why is there no attention given to these babies? Or why is there no attention given to black on black crime? Why is all the attention given to the handful, meaning single digits, of blacks that are killed at the hands of white cops? Not to mention, almost all those unarmed blacks who were killed resisted arrest. Okay, they were resistant arrest. Eric Gardner, I want to say, I forgot the name of a guy who was at a Wendy's. He stole the cop's taser and was running away. He turned around to shoot the taser at the cop when he got shot down and killed. So, these are things that escalated because of resistance. So, not to say that the cops were 100% innocent, but, you have to get all the facts down before you make a judgment. It wasn't just, this narrative of white cops looking to kill blacks. In fact, after Ferguson, there were statistics given on basically the proportion of whites versus blacks that were arrested. And what happened is it's actually more likely for a policeman to arrest a white person than a black. Why? Because now everyone's terrified of the backlash of apprehending blacks. Okay? Because again, the whole narrative is, there's an epidemic of racist white cops. So if you're a white cop, you think you're going to risk your livelihood, your career, your pension, maybe go to prison because of being labeled as a racist, the rest of your life? Probably not. Okay, so if anything, the crime against, I should say that undue brutality against blacks has gone down. All right, and there's another mantra: no justice, no peace. Okay, George Floyd, perfect example. I think we've all heard of him by now. Was justice served? Well, the the policeman Derek Chauvin, who is the actual one with his knee on his neck, I'm pretty sure he's going to be locked up for life, right? He is. I think he's on suicide watch now. All right, but not just him, but like the 3 or 4 officers that were with him, they all are going to be penalized. Okay, so justice to the fullest extent, I'm sure will be served. In fact, well, I shouldn't get into it, but the whole politics of it all. Basically, don't be surprised if there's more rioting after the actual trial, because he was overcharged. He was charged, I think, with second-degree murder. All right, Derek Chauvin was. And it's really hard to prove that he was out to murder him, especially when you look at the additional footage that was released recently, weeks after all the protests, weeks after all the rioting and even the funeral. There was more footage that was given, that was released, okay, that again showed that George Floyd was not cooperating with the police from the beginning, again, which escalated it. So my point is, justice was served. All right, so why is there suddenly this outcry? No justice, no peace. What? Well, justice for who? George Floyd got his justice. Of course, he's dead. You can't fully redeem that. But to the fullest extent of the law, he was, his perpetrators were punished. Okay, so what more is there? Now, going back to the real story here, which is homicide is the leading cause of death for black men aged 15 to 34, according to the CDC, right? We don't hear about that. Okay, we hear the word systemic racism or systemic biases. And the point that Coleman Hughes made was that the left's view on racism, the concerns that they raise are not actually attached to the suffering. Again, Black Lives Matter, I'm trying to make the point that thousands of blacks are dying at the hands of other blacks through homicide, through violent means. Thousands of babies, okay, every year are being murdered in their mother's womb. So that's the suffering that's going on, right? That's the suffering. Yet where's the narrative? We don't hear anything about that. We just hear about George Floyd and cops. Okay. So, systemic racism. It's a term, Jacob, have you ever heard that before?
Well, recently more on the media, but before that, maybe here and there, not memorable, but certainly yes.
Okay, so here is a very crude experiment that you could, but I mean, it's not an experiment, but it's actually been done. If there's such a thing as systemic racism, which means that, fundamentally, it's just harder for blacks to succeed because, the system, whatever that may be, whether it's in housing or education or in the workforce, is out to limit them, from advancing. All right. So here's basically Coleman Hughes' point. When you look at immigrants from the West Indies versus immigrants from Africa, so basically African Americans versus those from the West Indies. Right, second generation West Indies. So they're born in the United States, right? So these are all black people born in the U.S. but with different countries of origin. Now, physically they look very similar. In other words, if you're not black, you pretty much can't tell the difference between someone who's from the West Indies, such as in Jamaica, versus someone who's from Africa. All right. Now, I don't have the years here, but basically, there was a statistic that showed that the West Indians made 58% higher income on average than the Black Americans. All right, I'm sorry that I don't have the year for this. Now, that's just one measure. It doesn't mean that income is not the measure of all things, but it's an indicator, right? It's an indicator. Okay, so those from Jamaica. Here's a disclaimer. Those who do immigrate from places in the West Indies, as opposed to from Africa, which is, we know, that ancestry goes back to slavery. That was involuntary immigration. Immigration, by and large, from the West Indies was voluntary. All right, so those who come from places like Jamaica or the Bahamas, they're of a certain, they generally have a certain work ethic and certain ambition, certain characteristics that, enable them to succeed. Okay, so they're not typical, they're not representative of the entire country that they come from. All right, so now having said that, they might be more well-educated, okay? the rate of high school graduation, college graduation, and crime rates differ between the West Indians and the African Americans. All right, so that's something to consider, right? If there's systemic racism, they should equally be suffering, but yet they don't, or yet the outcomes are very different. So what explains that? There was a Pew poll. Okay, Pew is a very reputable organization that conducts polls. They asked Black Americans, without a high school degree, was there some kind of systemic racism that held you back? What percent said no? 60% of uneducated Black Americans said no, there was nothing holding me back. It was just my own personal decisions. All right. Gallup, which is another very reputable organization, Gallup poll asked if jobs and housing were systemically racist. Again, 60% said no. Now, going back to the comparisons, West Indians were more likely to come from a two-parent home and more likely to be socially conservative, meaning, for example, you treat your parents with respect, you don't talk back, and this kind of thing. All right. So the point here is that culture can make a huge difference. Culture, most likely, in my opinion, is the difference, right? Because look at the percent of kids who are born out of wedlock in single-family homes from among African Americans. So interestingly, if you go back to like the 1890s and 1900s, even up to like 1940s, blacks were actually predominantly born into two-parent households. Right. Not only that, the unemployment rate among blacks, I know this from Thomas Sowell, was actually like 9.8%, I think it was, in the 1940s. All right, which is a little bit less than whites at the time. So blacks were being born into two-parent households and, by and large, working, right, if not in school. Well, what happened in the 1960s? 1960s, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, essentially set in motion more government aid, right? The welfare state. All right. Now, welfare in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think most of us agree that there needs to be some safety net, so to speak, for those who really just can't make ends meet, or just for different reasons, can't. I guess you can say can't trade their skills in the marketplace. All right. But when government gets too big, and this is a common theme over and over, which I'm sure we'll touch in various podcasts, when welfare gets too big, or government gets too big, here are some of the problems. Okay, so in the early 70s, they actually went door to door in predominantly black communities, and they'd find out if a black mother was single, and if she was, then she would qualify for welfare. All right. If she was with another, with her husband or the baby's daddy, they didn't, quite simply. Well, what happens then, Jacob? There's an incentive, okay, to not have the baby daddy around, because you actually make more money, or I should say easy money, right, from the welfare state. Okay, so what happens is, I think it was 25% of African Americans were born out of wedlock in the 1940s. Again, my numbers, the exact years might be off, but the key change was in the 1960s, all right, until present. Now, 75% of black babies are born out of wedlock, okay? And of those 75%, I mean, almost all of them are in single-family homes, okay? Speaking of culture, all right, so 13-year-olds, there was a poll taken. What percent of 13-year-olds have had sex? 13-year-olds. 9% of whites. This is a pretty contemporary survey. I don't have the year with me, sorry. But 21% of black kids have had sex by age 13. So, that's more than double, right? This is culture. Okay, then there's spending habits. So the chance of an average black woman owning a luxury vehicle is higher than an average white woman owning a luxury vehicle, despite the fact that the average income is much, much less among blacks and whites. Okay, so what does that say? Less saving, less investing, more spending, more splurging. Right now, this is not to make a judgment on how you spend your money. In a free country, you can do whatever you wish. But it should be noted that what you spend your money on is going to have an effect on your ability to do other things, right? Okay, so. All right, so put another way, black women in the 1970s, they stood to lose money by getting married. All right, now, let me go back to the issue of cops. This is from a conversation that Larry Elder had with Dave Rubin again. And this is about an 8-minute video. It's a clip from like a longer interview, and it's really a must-see because Larry Elder, black conservative radio host, he, by the way, he made a documentary that just came out this year called Uncle Tom. That's the title, Uncle Tom, of a new documentary that really exposes racism, or the lack thereof, in America. Well, this man is pretty brutal, okay, when it comes to having a debate. Now, he made, I'll just list off some things he said. So, all right, so there's a conception that blacks are more willing to shoot cops are more willing to shoot black perpetrators over whites. I already talked about that before. Why they're not, right? They're fearful. They don't want to lose their jobs, right? People care at the end of the day about their family, about their, their retirement. There's not this agenda to go kill strangers because of their skin color. Just use your common sense for a minute. Like, who does that, right? And at the end of the day, we all got to eat, right? So I'm not gonna, as much as, for example, with my job, I have qualms about higher education. I'm not gonna bite the hand that feeds me. I might nibble on it, but I'm not going to bite it, all right? Now, let's go back to this. There were 965 people shot and killed by cops. Of those 965, this is, I'm sorry, again, I don't have the year, maybe about 5 years ago. 4% were whites shooting unarmed blacks. In the city of Chicago, 70% of homicides in Chicago were black on black. Okay? That's about 500 homicides per year. 75% of those were unsolved. Where's Black Lives Matter with these unsolved murders? Do Black Lives really matter to Black Lives Matter? Okay? Now, speaking of media, if you watch CNN and MSNBC, you should know by now, or if you don't already, this is basically like leftist propaganda, all right? These networks. Now, they're all over the stories when it's a white guy, when it's a white cop shooting a black. Okay. Baltimore is another example. 45% of Baltimore is black. The majority of the city council is black. The cops, the chief of police is black. Okay, the number 2 guy is black. The mayor was black. The attorney general is black. And yet we're talking about racism. So I forgot the man who made this point. There's another link to a video I'll put down called Black Wisdom Matters. This is various snippets of conversations. And the guy made the point. What did he say? I'm going to just find it right here. So, why are poor blacks failing in systems that are run by their own people? Okay? The blacks have all the power in these democratic cities, they're almost all democratic run, big cities are, with these like high rates of crime and violence among blacks. Well then, why are they failing if it's blacks are running the show? Okay, where's the racism there? So, all right. So the video is really engaging because, Dave Rubin's a great guy. I mean, he's a really good interviewer, and I give him credit for keeping the video up because it was really embarrassing for him. And he's recovered since. He's actually had Larry Elder on since then. But, Larry Elder was asking him, okay, give me an example of systemic racism. So anytime someone says America is systemically racist, that's such a broad statement, right? You need examples, and then you can talk about it. Well, Dave Rubin just couldn't think of any examples other than the police one. So then Elder actually proposed one. He said, okay, well, what about getting into school? And Larry Elder said, well, that's BS because there's affirmative action. Now, let me talk about affirmative action for just a minute. Okay? Tom Sowell already has talked a lot about this as well. If you think about affirmative action, what it does, okay, is it basically is a quota that, based on race, demands that institutions, universities, allow a certain percentage of applicants to be admitted based on race, essentially. But the message that sends is, these groups, they can't get in on their own, right? They can't qualify on their own. How condescending is it to say that, okay, blacks, you can't qualify based on your academics and your extracurricular activities on your own? Now, the counter argument will be, there's racism, right? There's racism. That's why they're not getting in. Okay, well, my question is, show me an example of a person of color who has matching credentials in terms of GPA, SATs, all the traditional measures, who was not admitted. I don't see much of that. What I do see instead is I see those who have lower GPAs or lower SAT scores, that are admitted. And what Thomas Sowell makes the point of is, okay, it's not actually a good thing for blacks who are really intelligent and hardworking to get into an Ivy League school like Harvard or Princeton and then fail or flunk out because they didn't measure up. All right, now his point, Tom Sowell's point, was that we should match applicants with schools where they can thrive. Why put them in a place where they can't? And that's exactly what happened for many of them. So that's one result. Let me think of it in a different realm. Larry Elder made a great point again. Like when you fly a plane, when you get on a plane, and you see a black pilot, do you want to worry? Do you want to ask yourself, I wonder if he got this job from affirmative action? All right. No, you're not gonna care what color skin he is. You're gonna care if he is a qualified pilot, that he did well in his flying pilot exams. Right. That's what matters. Is can he get the job done? In the same way with in an ER visit. Jacob, your family who's well familiar with hospitals. Do you think your family's gonna care about the skin color of their doctors, or are they gonna care about getting the best medical treatment? Right. So it's the same thing. Like why, affirmative action creates these kinds of problems where, you're first of all, you're putting people who are beneficiaries in places where they may not succeed. Okay, you're creating that doubt, and you're theoretically you're removing qualified people. Now you probably heard about the controversy at Harvard with Asian Americans, right? Because there's such a disproportionate number of Asians who qualify to Harvard that they changed the admissions policy, and they kind of added this thing called what was it called? They rate them on their sociability. Okay, they rate them on basically like how well they might mix in based on their social skills. And on those ratings, Asians typically got a lower score than other races, and therefore some of them didn't get in. Now, I have mixed feelings about that particular issue because, at the end of the day, I don't think you have a right to go to college. You don't have a right if it's a private school. Now, if it's a publicly funded school, that might be different, right? So, but let's not get into that whole debate. I think just suffice to say that affirmative action has its share of issues. All right. Now, I'll give one last example in sports. Right, the NBA. I'm watching the NBA playoffs nowadays. Most of the NBA is black. I think like 75-80%. Well, is there affirmative action? Should there be affirmative action to let more non-blacks in the NBA? Should they lower the rims so that it's easier to dunk? Should they give a head start to non-black athletes in the Olympics when there's a marathon or a sprint where blacks dominate? Like no one says that, right? No one mentions these kind of things. So why is it that we're making these adjustments in other areas, right? Like why is it that we demand a certain percentage of racial representation in outcomes when that's not the case in other fields, right? That's the point Thomas Sowell makes. In almost every institution, whatever it may be, there's not a representative of the general population based on race. All right, it's based on skill. It's based on your ability, right? It's based on your traits. So why are we trying to artificially manufacture the outcomes? That just doesn't make any sense, and it creates so many problems. All right, so the poorer you are, the more accessible loans and grants are. All right, let me just say this. Denzel Washington, for those who like to listen to celebrities, Larry Elder again. What's the number one problem then, if it's not racist white cops? Number one problem is the breakdown of the family, right? In Black America. Again, 75% of babies, no dads. That's a problem. That leads to more crime. Okay, so what can you do? Reverse the welfare state. Make it, don't take away the incentive to rely on the government. Take away the incentive to have a single family home. Okay? We've economically incentivized women to marry the government and for men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. Okay, now if you don't believe me, because I'm, here I am, Asian guy, Asian American, talking about Black America. There's a video link I put down with rappers that are actually talking about what to do in the Black community. It's not the message of Black Lives Matter, by the way. Okay? All right. Here's a new point. I'm almost done here. If you're a progressive, according to, I think his name is John McWhorter, all right, you want to keep race front and center because it works for you politically. That's a general theme of criticism of Democrats in general. And that's a general theme outside of the topic of race, environmental issues, academia, okay? Think about the concept of, it all comes back to individual self-interest. People act in their own interest. If you're a politician who gets votes by generating like an emotional anger among a base, such as, let's just say, the Black community, right? It benefits you to keep this narrative alive that there's racism, right? It's just like in the medical field, like, there's a theory which I think is well founded, is logical, that the health industry is a business, right? They want you to stay sick. They don't want to cure people. They want to treat people, and there's a difference there. If you're constantly treating people, that means more money from doctor visits, from pharmaceuticals, etc., right? Now maybe that's a different podcast topic, but this whole idea that like there are people who have a motivation to keep the problem or the perception of a problem. It's not even a real problem, I think, but the perception of it alive. So people like Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, they only pop up, to rouse up the emotions when there's something like a white cop shooting a black man. All right, intellectuals, meaning higher education, they teach. They even from lower levels of education, right? They're teaching this idea of victimhood, that you're a victim. Okay, that there's a system out there to get you, or that the white man's out there to get you. Blacks have to ask themselves, why are they living under this kind of delusion? Now, if you look at other racial groups, obviously, people have been discriminated against, racial or even ethnic groups, right? Cultural groups, religious groups, like Jews. If you look around the world, there's always going to be discrimination. That's just human nature, right? Here in Korea, which we'll hear about soon, right? There's going to be discrimination, all right? But the question is, what do the people do about it? Are they going to blame XYZ employer because they don't hire my kind, or are they going to start a business? Like, for example, the Jews. I mean, they basically learned a skill, in this case, the garment industry or the entertainment industry. Now they dominate Hollywood. They dominate, all right? Ben Carson, another Black American who I highly admire, a neurosurgeon. I think he's retired now. Now he's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Trump. He says, the people who say you have to think a certain way because of the color of your skin, and if you don't, something's wrong with you, those are the real racists. Okay, so all this talk about racism. Racism, by definition, is treating people a certain way because of an immutable trait like skin color. In this case, their skin color, right? It's making judgments or analyzing people, assumptions about people based on skin color. That's racism, ultimately. And so think about it. The people who are really racist are the ones who are saying that if you're black, you are automatically a victim. If you're black, you're automatically, entitled to reparations. Okay. Now, Morgan Freeman. I didn't know Morgan Freeman was so outspoken in this way, but there are several interviews with him. When to the question, how do you get rid of racism? His answer was this: stop talking about it. Stop having Black History Month to draw some kind of awareness to blacks among history, because American history, or Black history, is American history, right? Just like Asian history, Asian Americans, have a history in America. So American history encompasses all the different racial groups. You don't have to isolate one and draw attention to that. And I'll end with Denzel Washington, because I like what he said here. You can't legislate love. I notice among Koreans, a lot of the talk is, we got to change the laws, we got to make stricter laws about this and that. You can do that, and you can even try to enforce them more strictly. However, at the end of the day, people are going to do what's in their heart to do. All right, you can't legislate love, and now it's sort of a cliche to say, well, all we need is love. Well, that is true, but how do you achieve that? Of course, I'm going to say it's got to be supernatural, but at the same time, it comes from parents, right? And what Denzel's point was this: you teach your son how to love, all right, not to hate. You'll see a new society. They're not arresting 7-year-olds, right? But the 7-year-olds who are filled with hate from a young age, they're the ones that are going to grow up. And when I say grow up, I mean 12, 13, 14, committing these violent offenses, if not murder, okay? That are going to be perpetuating this problem that we see in the black community, in other communities, but we're here primarily to talk about black Americans. So there's some things to think about, and we'll shift gears now. I've been talking for 35 minutes. I'm sorry, but that's about right. If you talk for another 20 or 30, let's shift the focus now to Korea, or anywhere else, I guess. So, Jacob, what are your thoughts on racism here on the East Side?
Okay, so where to begin after all that? So bringing it down to a more personal level, where many individuals can also agree upon or share experiences. My personal experience with racism began at a very young age in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, prior to that, one small and funny example I would like to share is that when I was in Korea, before I went to the States, my grandmother, being one of the elderly who have little to no experience with the foreign cultures and the global nature that we are experiencing now, once told me that I think I was maybe 1 or 2 years old, and I guess I showed interest in coffee that my grandfather and my grandmother were drinking. And I remember my grandmother telling me that if you drink coffee, your skin will turn black. Of course, she was not alluding to any certain type of race or bearing any negative connotation against any certain type of ethnicity. It was just a plain parenting type of thing where you're just trying to discourage a child from doing a certain thing. A few years later, I moved to the States with my parents, and I went to preschool, and upon seeing some of my black classmates, I remember thinking, oh, his parents probably let him have coffee. Now, I think that on a personal level that we experience on a daily basis, there are two different types of racism. One is prejudice racist that my friend Jim spoke about abundantly, and there is unintended racism. Now, I would like to say that what my grandmother told me cannot be justified, but it cannot be antagonized because it was unintended. She wasn't trying to embed in me that darker skin equals bad. It's just something that, well, I'll get to in a minute, but the elderly Koreans have a really difficult time grasping. So I believe that one thing for sure is that we humans are not born racist, but we are born with instincts to fear something that is different from ourselves. So I think if we grew up in a culture with an equal mix of different ethnicities and skin color, we might suffer a lot less from what is causing all this ruckus about racism and segregation against a certain ethnic group. But because we all happen to be living in a society where there's a disproportionate imbalance of ethnicity in the mix, we do tend to experience something like that. And the best way to overcome it is education. Because a child who grew up in an environment with people who only share the same skin color as him or herself will absolutely fear someone with a different skin color. Now, that is natural. Now, in order to overcome that, it's up to the parents or the people around them, and even teachers or even peer groups, to constantly remind them that there's nothing to fear and we're all the same people. And gradually that person will grow up knowing that it is not our place to judge people based on how they look or even the color of their skin. So let's say I went somewhere, I'm clearly Asian looking, And if I went to, say, a black community where the majority of the population is black, and say a 2-year-old kid saw me and was afraid to talk to me, not only because I was a stranger, but because I looked different, would I take offense? Would I call that child a racist? No, I would think it is natural. Now, I might also add that maybe 2 years old is a little too early to receive that education, especially if it's not something that you happen to experience every day. Now, if you're a 1 or 2 year old and you go to a daycare center with a mixed ethnicity, then of course the parents might need to remind the kid a few times that you should not treat people differently. You should not treat your classmates differently just because they look different. And also, let's say I went to a different country where I'm the only Asian in the group, and they assume that I must be good at math, or that I must be great at StarCraft. Would I take offense? No. Most likely, it's because the stereotype that they're throwing at me, are usually positive. That I excel at something just because of the way I look or because of my cultural background. But even if it were a case of a group of friends teasing me about, like, what if a friend told me, "Oh, how can you see all that with such small eyes?" Would I take offense? Depending on the situation, yes or no. Like, if they were friends we have a mutual understanding with, then I probably will hit them back with something that's true to their race or their group. But if I heard that on the street from a random stranger, yes, I might take a little offense and just have to shove it, shake it off, and just say, yeah, there are bigots everywhere. Now, I know a YouTuber who is Indian British, so he grew up in a family with Indian parents, but he's British, and he is a YouTuber, and he's really good at playing games, and his net worth right now is about £7 million. His friends constantly tease him that he's a disappointment to his parents because he did not become a medical doctor, which is a stereotype that people in general have on Indians and Asians, that their parents expect them to achieve better, to become doctors and lawyers or whatnot. And because he became a YouTuber, his friends tease him, and this is all well acceptable. Now, I want to point out that if we're just talking factually about certain traits that a certain ethnic group has, I don't think that can be labeled as racism. And if there's a mutual agreement with a certain group of people that you're in, you can also sometimes bash on each other according to their race without really being labeled as a racist. The problem is when you are judged based on your skin and receiving a negative treatment because of that, that is racism. In Korea, you don't really face a lot of racism on a daily basis because, first of all, we are still very much the majority of the Korean population is very indigenous. Now, you see many more foreigners in Korea nowadays than before, but still you see many people, especially older people, the elderly generation, you will still see them staring at foreigners just because they look different. And even among the young generation, they may not necessarily stare at foreigners, but from some of the things that they say amongst each other, I could tell that there is the seed of racism. Because even though the things they say to each other may not always be negative, the fact that they're segregating someone else depending on based on the color of their skin is, I think, a risky seed that may one day lead to racism. For instance, so a few years ago, I was dating a Russian woman, and we were on the elevator one time, and I saw this older woman staring at us, and she sort of threw this passive-aggressive remark, pretty much telling me, like, what are you doing with this foreign girl? Like, eventually you're gonna have to marry someone who's from the same background. But she didn't really say it directly to me, but she mumbled it on her own, making sure that it was audible to us. And pretty much the message was, you shouldn't date a foreign woman because you should stay with your own kind. Now, that is very, It's common. It's not really addressed as much because it's not becoming a social issue like it is in the States, but it's definitely there. And from the treatments that I see certain people display in public, oftentimes, does concern me to a point where if one day Korea does grow to become a salad bowl like the United States, we are in for a world of issues regarding racism. First of all, you can tell by the way Korean business owners, shop owners, treat their laborers or their employees who are from Southeast Asia or Central Asia or the Middle East. They receive horrible treatment. And one time I was with a Pakistani friend who worked for a Hyundai Engineering. Now, mind you, Hyundai Engineering is a giant. If he was in the R&D department, research and development, obviously he was smarter and much better achieved and made a lot more money than the average Korean, even the people that you meet, than the average Korean. And we met up and we wanted to go to a bar in Itaewon, and the bouncer specifically told us that if he's is of Pakistani national, he is not allowed, because they recently created a policy where Pakistani nationals cannot come to their bar. Now, the reasoning behind it, I assume, is because they've had a few instances where some Pakistani nationals came in, got drunk, and created problems. But are Pakistanis the only ones doing that? Or are all Pakistanis doing that? I know plenty of people from Pakistan who are very intelligent and gentle and who would never create a problem at a bar just because they're drunk. But why would the owner ban all Pakistanis from his bar? Simple. Lack of education, lack of awareness, and his convenience at the cost of potential customers' dignity. Likewise, many bars and clubs in the Itaewon and Hongdae area have a sign that says no American GIs allowed, because they have experienced so many instances where American soldiers would get drunk and start beating up people. And does that mean that all GIs are like that? No. So obviously it was, I guess, a result of lazy thinking on how to specifically prevent those things from happening, and just simply labeling all Pakistanis as aggressive. So one day, if Korea does become a salad bowl, we're in for a world of issues. And if you go into any social media group, like on Facebook or whatnot, you will also encounter many posts by foreigners where they receive unfair treatment just because they were foreign, and in many cases, they receive unfair treatment because they couldn't communicate with the people they were dealing with. This is an issue, and one thing that I mentioned previously during our pet peeves episode was that Caucasians tend to receive better treatment than they may deserve, often from Koreans. Because on one hand, we have bars that are banning Pakistan nationals altogether, and on the other hand, we have a Caucasian white male. Now, I'm not saying that all white males are like this, but specifically certain Caucasian males who, just by taking a look at them. Now, this may also be errored in the fact that I'm saying just by looking at them, but in general, people you wouldn't imagine with several gorgeous ladies at the table and becoming the focus of attention anywhere else, being just because we're in Korea, because Koreans assign authority to white. So you see a lot of people that you wouldn't imagine being popular among the opposite sex, being so popular, sitting at a table, having a drink with 3 or 4 Korean women and receiving the sole attention. Now, there's no problem with being the only foreigner in the group and being the center of attention, but if it happens over and over, and you witness those Korean women being how should I say, extra lenient towards Caucasians while being very strict to their own people, then you can safely conclude that they are only giving this man the leniency or the benefit of the doubt just because he's white. And you hardly ever see any group where a black male or a brown male is surrounded by several good-looking Korean women and receiving all the attention. So there it is in contrast. Now, like I mentioned earlier, if we were all living in a equally distributed populated area where each ethnicity, every skin color is pretty proportionately equal, then we might experience a lot less of what we feel might be racism. But because we're living in societies where we are very disproportionate, wherever we go, we will, to a certain extent, experience and witness racism that's going on. And going back to the main point, I think the only way to prevent that is by education from a young age. But like many people say, if you keep talking about racism, that in and of itself is what is promoting racism. So I think it should be more of a question of teach your kids to treat all people equally regardless of how they look, including the color of their skin or their features, how tall or how fat, how short or how skinny they are, or what gender they are, or what gender they choose to identify as. But if you specifically try to extinguish racism by talking about racism, you're only embedding it in young minds that, oh, race is a thing. People are actually segregating people depending on the color of their skin. And if you plant that thought in their mind, you will unintentionally make a connection between the skin color and treatment that they receive as a result of certain characteristics. Now, obviously, we must admit that, yes, Asians tend to have smaller eyes. Asians tend to be, on average, shorter in height. Black people tend to be usually physically more advanced, more athletic, yeah. Physically more athletic. And white people tend to be more hairy. Now, am I using those characteristics as a reason to treat them unfairly? No. We're just acknowledging our differences. Now, if you're mixed in a group equally, or if you're mixed in a group of mutual friends and you're all on good terms with each other, yeah, sometimes it's okay to poke fun at each other depending on how they look. We all do that amongst ourselves anyway. You think Korean kids go to school and never be bullied by others because of the way they dress or the way they look or the way they behave? No, it's everywhere. It's in our nature to want to express our frustration onto others in unfair ways, to fear people who look different, not only people but whatever that we don't understand, and want to be treated better than others. So is it only about race that is a problem? It is not. It's just a lack of awareness and education. And because of that, the issues may more often than not spill onto the issue of race. But that does not mean that now I don't know if I'm headed in the right direction of what I was intending. But yes, first, racism may not have had its light in Korean mainstream media yet, but it is something that is pending, and I am dreading that day when it finally comes, because I have heard several people talking about people of different races in ways that were not very intellectual and were very, in fact, prejudiced. But at the same time, should we make racism the sole issue that is affecting people in our everyday lives? Or should we address human bigotry in general and maybe get to the core of why people are bullying or mistreating others? And maybe and yes, acknowledge the fact that once we cure that, racism will follow. The cure to racism will follow. What do you think?
Well, I think you made a good point earlier when you were defining racism, that it's got to have some kind of negative treatment as a result of it. And I would even add that it's undue negative or positive treatment, right? So if you're a beneficiary based on your race, that's another form of, that's racism, right? That's being undue treatment is how I define it. Now, as you were talking, I was the word ignorance came to mind, okay? Because you talked about your personal experiences. I didn't mention much of mine, but I'll say this: like, I think there's a distinction to make between racism and ignorance, right? So most of what I've experienced in my life was just ignorance.
Right.
So as a kid, yeah, I got the ching chang chong. When I remember my first day of teaching in Los Angeles, in Long Beach. My very first day of teaching, my first year, is a mostly Hispanic community. I had little kids, elementary school kids, running up to me, or it wasn't many, but just one actually, and I forget exactly what he did, but he asked me, I think he called me Jackie Chan. Why? Because I probably look like I do kind of look like Jackie Chan with the big nose, but to him, with the limited Asian exposure he's had,
Right.
he thought I was Jackie Chan or looked like him or was related to him.
Right.
Okay? That's not racism. That's just ignorance.
Right.
And there's a big difference. In other words, that's not malevolent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I can't say I've ever experienced anything like malevolent. All right? When people say, oh, you're Asian, so do you know Taekwondo or you good at math? Like that, again, I wouldn't even say that's ignorance. I would say that's based on evidence. Like it's not, I think that's based on stereotypes.
Or limited experience.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the word stereotype wasn't mentioned enough because that also is, I think that word gets a negative connotation. I think it gets conflated with racism.
Right.
But it's really not the same thing because stereotypes are typically based on general trends, right? Mm-hmm. So when you mention the bar owners who
ban a specific
banned the
national.
Pakistani or the soldiers, that's based on evidence. Now, I'm all about private property. You got the right to do whatever. So if you want to say no blacks allowed or no I think you're within your right to do that. Now, is it a smart business move? Typically, it won't be because if you have a reputation of being a racist business owner, you're not going to get. Why would you reject,
Right.
money from why would you limit your customer base that way, right? Whether by reputation or literally from turning away people who want to pay you for your food or your service. So I want to make the point that it's not racist to go by stereotypes. When you mention joking with friends, that's almost all based on stereotypes.
Yeah.
Like Indians are typically a certain way, whether it's a cuisine or, you mentioned white people being hairy. I was thinking of Persians. Persians are hairy in general, right? Is that racist to say that? No, that's a fact, okay? That's just a fact.
And there are always exceptions. There are really
Yeah, of
hairy
course there-
Asians,
right.
and there are hairless
Correct.
Caucasians.
Correct.
Right?
All right. We could list a whole bunch of maybe we should have done that. Just have a bunch of stereotypes. Okay, is this
Yeah.
racist? I don't know. Now, the last thing I'll mention here is when you talked a little bit about how to raise our kids, right? So I believe that there's one God who created all of us. There's only one God, and we all come from the same Maker. We're all made in His image, which is what makes us distinct from other animals or other things like trees and rocks. Okay, so with that, I think that's the transcendent kind of reality which I try to tell my kids is look, you don't respect a person because of what you think they might be about or whatever. You respect them because they're made in God's image. Now, can people do good or bad? Of course, right? Are you going to make friends with people who have more in common with you? Of course. My upbringing in public school was in a secular. My upbringing most of my childhood was not in a religious environment, and it was not in a racially homogenous environment. So, I'm a good example of a person where race was just not talked about because it wasn't a big deal. We were more interested in playing sports together or what did the teacher say is our homework tonight? Because where I grew up was a pretty racially diverse area, Northern Virginia. And I went to public schools, and so my friends were representative of that. It was only when I started going to church, ironically enough, which was racially kind of distinct, as Korean Americans. It was only when I started going to church that the racial profile of people I hung out with was more homogenous, and that's why I'm thankful for that upbringing because even though you know even though most of my spiritual development was among other Korean Americans, I always, I guess, resisted the sort of overlap between our Christian identity with a racial identity, because Christianity, it's for all the world. It's not just it's not an American thing. It's not a Korean thing. So I didn't like the way that most of my Christian friends just stuck with other Korean Christian friends. I always try to make branch out, because I just felt like that's not what that's not representative. And I guess I'll make a last point, which is we talked about culture a little bit, and I think that there is a lot of overlap between race and culture. So when we say diversity, I don't think that we should aim for racial diversity, but we should aim for cultural diversity. Meaning, like, culture is more like what's the way people think? What's the way people act? What are the values that are sort of distinct of a certain group of people? So that, to me, is diversity. Diversity of thought, of values, right? That's worth, I think, understanding, because you can kind of understand yourself better and other people better. Racial diversity, just purely based on race, may or may not actually be diverse. That's what the problem I have with a lot of corporate America, which is that, or even with going back to political talk, that the left, okay, they're really good at enforcing like this the superficial racial diversity, but there's very little actual diversity of thought. It's like you have to agree with the agenda, you have to agree with our perspective, or you don't belong. You look different, but you have to think the same. That's not diversity. To me, you could all look the same, but then if you think differently, there's something to value there.
Now, let's say you're hanging out with a group of friends with a good mix of different skin color and ethnicity, and your group decided to play basketball. And as you're choosing teams, some members of your group says, "Hey, I want to side with this guy because he's a black guy." Do you call that racism? Should we criticize that guy for racial profiling? Or let's say we're taking an exam and we're all studying in the library for an exam, and the guy comes up to me and I'm going to ask you for a math problem. Why, of all the other friends that he could have asked? Because I'm Asian? Is that racism? I want to say no. On the individual level, we tend to go with evidence. Evidence shows that the majority of NBA players are black. So naturally, if a person sees a black person, you might think, oh, that person might be more athletic, especially in basketball. If it turns out he's not, fine. It doesn't matter. Evidence suggests that Asians are really meticulous and tenacious at being good at math and science. So if someone came up to me and asked me a math problem, and if I couldn't solve it, and he's like, oh, I'm disappointed, you're Asian. But that's not a pleasant interaction, but is that racist? Is that racial profiling? No. But I guess an ignorant example of racial profiling is the case where you just ban an entire nationality just because a few people from that country created problems in your business. Yeah.
Let me talk about math for a second. I'm not sure that stereotype is even true anymore, because if you think about why Asians got that stereotype, it's, I think, going back to culture. It's how we were raised. Like, I don't know about you, but my dad made a times table chart for my brother and I to memorize from a pretty young age. I mean, it's just putting in the time.
Yeah.
And the reason why I don't think it holds anymore is I feel like I can think of a lot of Asians who are not good at math, even basic math. Why? Because maybe somewhere along the line, the generations, the parents stopped being as as actively involved with the basics of arithmetic. So, it just goes to show that it's not about race. It's not some kind of genetic, inherited ability. It's just about, did you study? Did you put the time in?
Yeah.
To learn your times tables or whatever the case may be,
Right. But I believe the reason why that became a stereotype, even though it has never been true in history, is probably because the most of the Eastern Asian countries have an education system where you are pretty much forced to be injected with all this information on everything. So, for instance, I remember when I went to elementary school in the States, when we were studying Europe, the teacher divided the class into different groups, and each group was in charge of one country. And within that group, let's say my group was in charge of Sweden, and we had maybe 4 people in the group, and not all 4 of us had to research the same thing. We divided it up into, okay, you research history, I'll do government, you do agriculture, and you do just culture. And at the end of the project, all the groups will take turns presenting their research and the results of their project. So the class would, in general, learn a few iconic information about a certain country or culture. But in Korea, the entire class would have to study meticulously every country all together, exactly the same: history, government, culture, agriculture, climate, and whatnot. Likewise, mathematics, like he said, Asian parents would usually force their kids, even teachers will force their kids to memorize the entire timetable from 1 to 9. And we also have like these really thick exercise books that are supposed to supplement our school textbooks, but at some point in time has actually replaced our textbooks. So nowadays the Korean textbooks are really great, but back when I was in middle and high school, the textbooks here were so useless. If you spend your entire time memorizing everything in your textbooks, there is a higher probability that you will flunk whatever test you took in that subject. We were forced to go to the bookstore and pick out our own supplementary exercise books with hundreds and thousands of problems to solve to prepare for one exam. Which is pretty much why, if you get to the higher achieving levels of the schools in the United States, like per se Ivy League schools, then chances are the Asian kids who are advanced enough to apply for those schools will have gone through that excruciating amount of time and effort going through not only math, but every single subject. But pretty much people in the world in general think that math and science is much more difficult than any other subject. So I guess in a way, oh, this kid's good at math. People didn't really care if this kid was good in social studies or another subject. They only care that, oh, this guy is really good at solving math problems. He's got really fast mental math abilities. They didn't care if he was good in Korean or the English language or linguistics or grammar. They only cared about, wow, this person's good in math. If you tell someone I majored in English literature, you don't get people saying, oh wow, you must be an expert in the English language. But if you tell someone I majored in math, people always say, oh, math, that was my worst subject. Wow, you must be brilliant. So math is a subject that tends to receive more attention than other subjects. And if you get to a high achieving level of schools, like especially in the Ivy League, you will have met several Asians who back home probably would have gone through that process of solving thousands of math problems over one subject, over one chapter. So yeah, that's pretty much how the stereotype was formed, even though it has never been true, that it's never been scientifically proven or biologically proven that Asians were born with an innate ability to solve math problems better than other races. But I guess if we said that even though it's not accurate 100% of the time, if we did say that, Caucasians are taller than Asians, yeah, pretty much it's true, because yes, as much as there are people like Yao Ming who are really tall, if you look at the average figures of every country, yes, it is true that the average size of Asian countries is usually shorter. Also in sexual organs, so.
Let me change the topics real quick on that one.
Okay.
I want to give a quick shout out to a guy I met today named Boris, who is from Russia. And coincidentally, our topic today is racism, and it's not every day that I meet a stranger of a different race, I guess. Mm-hmm. And he was out in front of McDonald's, basically asking people to buy him a Big Mac. I didn't know this until I approached him, because I was across the street at the coffee shop, and I could see through the window person after person after person rejecting him. And he was only approaching men, I noticed. I think he knew
Women will
if you
probably
approach a
take
woman,
it
it
the
would be
wrong
really
way.
scary. Yeah. But he kind of was a kind of disheveled looking guy. I guess you might have thought he was homeless, but anyway, it just kind of, well, I raised that to mention the irony that we're talking about racism, but also to mention that all Caucasians are given the royal treatment. It does
Right.
depend on how you dress and probably how you
How you
smell.
present yourself,
Because he did
yeah.
have a little bit of a stench. As it turned out, he was just traveling around Asia
Uh-huh.
and staying in a hostel and didn't have much money. He was offering me this little golden bill. I don't know what it was. I just said, hey, forget it. But I respected him because he didn't just ask for money, which who knows where it goes to.
Yeah.
But he said, I just want a Big Mac.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, I'll help him out, you know. It's not a big deal. It's not that much. And
So
yeah.
shout out to Jim
Yeah.
for buying a stranger a Big Mac.
Well, it was a neat story to share. I thought of maybe not sharing it because I'm not trying to make myself look like some hero, but I just want to remember it for the time's sake. All right, but let's wrap this puppy up. It's our usual wordiness that's gone over an hour. We'll keep working on that, but hey, this is episode 5. Hopefully, there are many to come. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing your comments. Check out the links below to the different things I cited, not Jacob. Maybe you'll add some. And until next time, our topic is yet undetermined, but we'll see you soon enough. We'll see you when we see you.
Yeah, we'll see you when you
That
see
should
ya.
be our tagline. Yeah. All right.